This investigation stretches across borders, from Italy back to the UK. It begins with Jason Peter Marshall, born August 11th, 1988, into a South London home already crumbling under the weight of addiction. Life didn't exactly deal him a winning hand. By the time he hit 10 years old, his world had fallen apart. Both parents were locked up, leaving Jason to deal with the fallout alone. He got bounced around from a children's home in Southend to a revolving door of foster placements. Then, in a questionable move, social services decided to send him back to his mother once she got out of prison. That reunion was a disaster. She wasn't fit to parent, and the instability took a toll. By 12, Jason's mind started playing tricks on him. He was hearing voices and seeing things that weren't there. His delusions were wild angels, aliens, even believing he was the Archangel Gabriel in the flesh. As a teen, doctors added another layer to the puzzle: an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis, marked by an intense, obsessive focus on details. Coupled with zero social skills, making friends was basically impossible. So, he did what you'd expect. He shut the door on reality and withdrew deep into his own head. Usually, folks with ASD thrive on structure, but Jason's life was pure anarchy, fueling his anxiety and depression. To a stranger, though, he looked totally fine, young, fit, and composed. With brown cropped hair, chestnut eyes, and clear skin, he looked the part of a normal kid, but inside, total wreckage. He felt worthless, aimless, and absolutely hated the person looking back in the mirror. He felt like a zero, but he noticed something important. People respected uniforms. They respected authority. So, he decided to borrow some of that power for himself. He started playing dress-up, posing as officials to command respect. There's a story that he once threw on an air cadet uniform just to scam money from charity collections. He didn't stop there. He posed as a ticket inspector on the tube to hand out fake fines and allegedly talked his way into police stations in Suffolk and Kentish Town just to swipe radios. He even claimed to have busted criminals using a DIY warrant card. It's wild how much power a costume gives you. Whether those stories were real or just more delusions is up for debate, but in 2008, at 20 years old, he tried to end it all. That attempt got him sectioned under the Mental Health Act. They shipped him off to the John Howard Center, a psych unit over in East London. It wasn't exactly Fort Knox, so he managed to break out. While on the run, he went on a spree of minor crimes that eventually landed him behind bars for a bit. Once he was out, the authorities tagged him for the Dangerous and Severe Personality Disorder Service. That meant life on a tight leash with constant surveillance. 2 years down the line, he slipped his handlers again during a transfer to a hostel. Didn't last long, though they caught him and threw him right back in prison, flagging him as a continued danger to the public. By early 2012, he was back on the streets, supervised only by his local doctor. He actually managed to pull it together briefly, finding a place to stay and landing a gig cleaning streets during the London Olympics. For a minute, he had a purpose. He was living a normal life, but the second he lost that job, the stability crumbled and he nosedived into depression and the bottle. We're talking 8 beers and half a bottle of Jack Daniels every single day. Worse, he was washing his meds down with that booze, a lethal combination. That mix fried his brain, leading to serious blackouts. At rock bottom, desperate for some sense of control or identity, he started looking for a new role to play. He turned to male escorting to make ends meet. Broke and mentally spiraling, Jason Marshall invented a shield to hide behind a brand new alter ego to distance himself from his trauma. He hit the apps Grindr, Badoo, Adult Work operating under the handle Gabriel. He built a client list there, charging a steep £400 an hour for his time. He wasn't offering vanilla dates either. This was niche stuff. S&M, bondage, roleplay. He hunted for a specific type. Smaller, older men, usually with Italian roots. He went all out with the theatrics, dressing up as an MI5 agent, complete with a homemade uniform. He'd play the bad cop, arresting clients on fake charges to kick off the scene. The dates played out like intense interrogations. He'd strip these guys down and tie them to the bed, taking total control. It was all about absolute dominance. He'd push them until they were begging for mercy, walking that fine line between terrified and thrilled. It was a potent, dangerous high. Everything changed one Sunday evening when his path crossed with 58-year-old Peter Fasoli on Badoo. Peter was a quiet IT tech of Italian heritage who kept to himself. He lived in a tiny, one-story bungalow in London, barely 25 feet wide, a modest spot for a modest man. The place had a huge window across the front and a small patch of grass with some potted plants and a bird feeder. Peter had a soft spot for nature. The bungalow looked like an afterthought tacked onto a row of terraced houses, which kind of mirrored Peter himself. He was gay, single, and deeply introverted, never quite fitting into the loud world around him. He'd been in the neighborhood for years, but hardly anyone knew his name. Inside, his house was a perfect reflection of his solitary, tech-focused life. One side of the room was a wall of tech webcams, hard drives, monitors, and towers all stacked up. A small two-seater sofa faced his digital command center, serving as his main social hub. Tucked behind that was a box room so small you could barely squeeze a double mattress inside. Tragically, this little bungalow became a crime scene. It's heartbreaking, especially hearing his family in the north speak about him. His sister, Anne, remembered him as a guy who was genuinely fun to be around. She described a man with a dry wit and a cheeky streak that could light up a room. You couldn't find anyone with a bad thing to say about him. He was the type to give a stranger his last penny pure heart. But socially, he struggled. Being short, shy, and a bit heavyset made the real world intimidating for him. Face-to-face chats were hard, and since his world revolved around IT, he didn't get out much or have many chances to make friends. To make matters worse, a heart condition often left him breathless, forcing him to stay home even more. He kept an oxygen tank by his bed just to manage the episodes. That's why he turned to the web. The anonymity gave him a courage he never had in person, letting him connect with people from the safety of his keyboard. Online, he could be open about his desires and look for love or hookups without the immediate fear of rejection. It's a common story. Plenty of people live their real lives behind a screen. But that position leaves you exposed. Peter met all sorts of characters online, unaware of the danger lurking in the data streams. Eventually, his digital search led him straight to Jason Marshall. It was December 2012 when Peter stumbled across Jason's profile on Badoo. Jason's bio was practically written for Peter, seeking quiet, older, short Italian men. They matched, started chatting, and Peter felt safe enough to invite this stranger into his sanctuary. The messages flowed, and they struck a deal. To Peter, it looked like an exciting night on the horizon. They set the date for the evening of January 6th, 2013. The plan was simple: a consensual night at Peter's place to explore bondage and shared fetishes, no strings attached. On January 6th, 2013, Jason hopped on the Central Line, traveling from Stratford out to Northolt. Under his jacket, he was already wearing his bizarre version of an MI5 uniform. His getup consisted of a black woolen beanie, a cropped jacket, standard blue jeans, and a dark backpack. He pulled up around 7 p.m., where Peter was waiting to greet him. The vibe was initially stiff but courteous. It played out like a classic first date between two shy guys. They broke the ice with nervous laughter about finally meeting face to face, and Peter seemed totally at ease with his well-groomed guest. Things moved inside, where the mood was set with low lights and soft tunes. That's when Jason unveiled his homemade intelligence officer costume, which looked nothing like the real deal. The kit was a hodgepodge of props, centered around a lanyard holding a bogus ID card that identified him as Jason Marshall, British Secret Intelligence. His utility belt was stocked with latex gloves, flex cuffs, a replica firearm, a fake canister of pepper spray, and an ancient Nokia phone modified to look like a tactical radio. By 7:30, the pleasantries were over. Jason abruptly told Peter he was under arrest for treason and government hacking. Looming over his host, Jason ordered him to strip naked, and Peter complied. He was then told to lie flat on the bed. At first, the spike of adrenaline was part of the thrill for Peter, but the dynamic quickly spiraled out of his control. Jason reached into his bag and produced a roll of heavy-duty duct tape. Systematically, Jason bound Peter's hands and feet, then slapped a piece of tape over his lips. Immobilized and helpless, Peter was now entirely at the mercy of the man in his bedroom. Jason began rifling through Peter's folded clothes until he found the wallet. Switching from roleplay to robbery, Jason demanded the PIN for Peter's bank card. When the victim hesitated, Jason immediately ramped up the aggression. He pressed the cold steel of a hunting knife against Peter's cheek. The charade was over. This wasn't a consensual scene anymore. It was a hostage situation. As Peter refused to give up the code, the brutality intensified. Jason was fully immersed in his twisted spy fantasy, going so far as to prep a syringe he claimed contained truth serum. In reality, the needle was loaded with haloperidol, a powerful antipsychotic that does nothing to induce honesty. Peter's muffled screams were swallowed by the tape and the backdrop of classical music. In the corner, Peter's pet bird shrieked in panic, mirroring the horror in the room. Jason then began to torture Peter, sadistically burning him with a lit cigarette. The agony dragged on as the night wore on. As midnight neared, Peter's body began to fail him. Deprived of his oxygen tank and straining against a heart condition, he was gasping for air. He had no option left but to surrender the pin. It was pay up or die. Jason briefly exited the bungalow to drain 780 pounds from an ATM at a nearby Shell station. He bought a few things and headed straight back to the scene of the crime. He slipped back inside after midnight, and the tone shifted from robbery to execution. Peter begged for his life, but Jason had already decided to liquidate his witness. The final act began with cling film. Jason wrapped the plastic tightly around Peter's head, sealing it over his face and nose to cut off all oxygen. Even trussed up like an animal and suffocating, Peter didn't go down without a fight. He struggled violently against the restraints, desperate for air. Jason grabbed a plastic bag to finish the job, and their violent thrashing sent them tumbling off the bed, landing behind the sofa with a heavy crash. Eventually, the room fell silent, save for the crinkle of plastic and Peter's fading gasps. Standing over the dying man, Jason delivered a chilling, mock-religious send-off in Latin. He recited, "In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti," in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. He followed it with, "Ego sum resurrectio et vita," I am the resurrection and the life. By then, Peter was deep in unconsciousness, his lungs flooding with carbon dioxide. A lonely life ended in violent tragedy, Peter's last attempt at connection proving fatal. With his victim dead, Jason set about staging the crime scene to look like a random break-in. He tossed the room, emptying drawers and sweeping shelves. Strangely, he ignored the valuables. He left the expensive tech and even the gold watch on Peter's wrist. To muddy the waters further, he flushed various objects down the toilet and ripped out cables from Peter's computer setup. He killed the music and cut the LED lights. In the sudden silence, Jason lit a cigarette to calm his nerves and methodically packed his gear. Then came the fire. He doused the furniture, the walls, and Peter's corpse with accelerant. With a flick of his lighter, the room erupted, quickly filling with choking black smoke. At 12:41 in the morning, Jason walked out, convinced he'd committed the perfect crime. To cover his tracks, he sent a text to Peter via the Badoo app at 9:33 the next morning. Writing as Gabriel, he texted, "Sorry, I bailed last night. Wasn't feeling well. Want to meet up soon?" A few hours later, he followed up with, "Are you there?" He kept up the charade with messages like, "Don't ignore me. I said I was sorry." And "Stop being mean." When silence was his only answer, he sent a final, "Fine. Be like that." That was the end of the digital trail. Peter's death yielded a few £100 and a botched initial investigation, leaving the Badoo killer free to hunt again. The very reason we know these harrowing details is also the reason Jason was eventually nailed for the crime. While frantically ripping out cords, he missed a single webcam. The entire torture session and the murder were recorded in high definition. But before that footage was discovered, Jason remained a free man. On Tuesday, January 8th, 2013, just 30 hours post-murder, he used Peter's card to book a trip to Italy. Nobody flagged the transaction. The card hadn't been reported stolen yet, the amount was low, and nobody was watching the account. By 6:50 in the morning on Friday, January 11th, Jason was airborne, leaving Gatwick for Rome. He proceeded to live large on the stolen cash, enjoying a carefree vacation. He enjoyed the high life for a bit, but the cash inevitably dried up. Jason returned to Badoo, using it not for dates, but as a digital hunting ground for vulnerable men. He didn't need to prowl the streets. The app served victims up on a silver platter. Profiles listed everything: age, build, living arrangements, and sexual kinks. It was all the intel Jason needed to filter for targets who were older, lived alone, and had submissive tendencies that fed his sadistic appetite. On January 26th, 20 days after killing Peter, he linked up with 67-year-old Vincenzo. A retired tour guide and divorced dad, Vincenzo was a well-liked figure in his local area. Still hiding behind the Gabriel persona, Jason used the exact same playbook that had led to Peter's demise. They met at 7 p.m., looking for all the world like a standard first date. Jason played the awkward card again. After a few pleasantries, he secured an invitation inside a pattern that was becoming terrifyingly predictable. Once through the door, the mask slipped. He donned the fake MI5 gear, claiming he was on a mission from the British Embassy. He sported the same homemade ID, plastic cuffs, and toy gun. This time, however, the threat was palpable. The utility belt held a real hunting knife, a baton, and actual pepper spray. Jason slipped back into the role of the agent. He placed Vincenzo under arrest for espionage. The older man played along, stripping down and allowing himself to be gagged and bound. Just like before, the game was about to take a dark, violent turn. Jason barked out a demand for the PIN code. When Vincenzo refused, Jason escalated the torture, searing the man's skin with a lit cigarette before cracking a baton against his body. Vincenzo was battered and burned, yet he somehow found the will to resist. That is, until Jason unleashed a stream of pepper spray, effectively choking the air out of his lungs. Finally, the resistance crumbled. With the code in hand, Jason bolted to a nearby ATM and drained 400 euros. He trashed the apartment to stage a robbery, though he sloppily neglected to simulate a forced entry. He raided the place for a debit card, electronics, a gate key, and the victim's vehicle. But this time, he deviated from his usual script. No cling wrap, no arson to cover his tracks. Instead, he chose a more hands-on approach. He wrapped an electrical cord around Vincenzo's throat, squeezing the life out of him in a slow, grueling ordeal until the man blacked out. The strangulation wasn't enough to satisfy him. Jason drew his hunting blade and plunged it into the man's chest repeatedly. Standing over the corpse, he muttered the last rites in Latin, a twisted final benediction. With no imminent threat chasing him off, he didn't panic. He slipped away into the night as cool and collected as when he had arrived. Vincenzo lay undiscovered for over 7 days, giving the killer a massive head start. Once the stolen cash ran dry, the itch returned. Jason was primed for another round of hunting, theft, and bloodshed. His crosshairs settled on Umberto Gismondi, a solitary Italian fellow with a penchant for bondage and power play. Like the others, Umberto agreed to a rendezvous after a digital flirtation. The guest arrived under the alias Gabriel, but the monster behind the mask was Jason Marshall, the infamous Badoo killer. It was 7 in the evening on February 21st, 2013. The mood was set with dim lights and smooth tunes. But unlike the previous encounters, this date had an uninvited audience. A police surveillance team parked right outside. Investigators were hot on his heels, having connected the digital dots from the Badoo chat logs to the earlier crime scenes. They had flagged the stolen vehicle and the transactions on Vincenzo's cards. Authorities watched as the pair ate dinner and watched TV, waiting for the inevitable violence that surprisingly did not happen immediately. The stakeout seemed like a bust. Assuming the night would remain peaceful, the surveillance unit packed up and clocked out, leaving the victim vulnerable. Behind closed doors, however, the vibe turned sour. Jason grew agitated when Umberto hesitated to take the roleplay to the extreme levels the killer demanded. When Umberto scoffed at Jason's ridiculous story about being an MI5 agent and laughed at his outfit, the killer's fuse blew. The reaction was instantaneous and savage. He unleashed a barrage of kicks, pepper spray, and baton strikes. Between the blows, the demand was the same as always: the PIN code. Like his predecessors, Umberto held out as long as he could. Under the escalating torture, he finally broke and whispered the numbers. He was battered and broken, clinging to life. Jason grabbed an iPad and drained another 400 euros, but as he prepped his exit, Umberto's gag slipped. A desperate scream pierced the air, alerting the neighbors to call the cops. Locals rushed to assist as law enforcement scrambled back to the address. Umberto managed to gasp out the name Jason, and officers immediately pinged the suspect's phone, GPS. The signal led them to a southbound bus on the outskirts of Rome. At 3:30 in the morning, the manhunt ended in handcuffs. Charges of murder and attempted murder were slapped on him immediately. Standing trial on July 9, 2014, he was convicted on all counts. The judge handed down a 16-year sentence, mandating that at least 3 of those years be served in a psychiatric facility. With the Badu killer locked up in Italy, that chapter was finished. But back in the United Kingdom, investigators were just getting started. A breakthrough emerged regarding the death of Peter, a forgotten webcam recording that captured the gruesome torture and killing in real time. Peter's nephew, Christopher, was the unfortunate soul who discovered the file. That horrifying video became the linchpin that completely turned the investigation around. Until then, authorities had written Peter's death off as an accidental house fire. The footage proved undeniably that it was a cold-blooded homicide. Armed with this bombshell evidence, British authorities launched a bid to drag Jason back from Italy to answer for Peter's death. Extradition is a complex diplomatic dance to transfer a prisoner across borders, but given the concrete proof of the murder, the paperwork moved swiftly. Italian and British officials worked in lockstep, and before long, Jason was on a plane back to British soil. Upon arrival, he was formally indicted. The subsequent trial exposed the jury to the nightmarish final minutes of Peter's life, played out on screen. The prosecution laid it all out. The damning video, the theft of the victim's bank cards, and the suspect's sudden flight to the continent. Against such a mountain of proof, Jason's legal team grasped at straws. They argued he had amnesia and tried to minimize his role in the atrocity. They played the mental health card, but the raw footage of the murder made it impossible to paint him as anything other than a calculating killer. The jury didn't buy it. Jason Marshall was found guilty and slapped with a life sentence, carrying a mandatory minimum term of 39 years behind bars. The punishment matched the sheer malice of the crime. The presiding judge didn't mince words, labeling the act sadistic and telling the defendant, "You tortured him for so long because you enjoyed it so much. I am sure that you feel no remorse whatsoever," the judge added. Whether Jason ever tastes freedom again will eventually be up to a parole board. The odds of him walking free are slim to none. Ultimately, his rampage serves as a grim warning about the dangers lurking behind online profiles.